We're just doing it. We're doing it live! The purpose of this video is not to tell you that the new killer, the Judgment, is overpowered. In fact, I don't think that's the right conversation to have at all. When people talk about killers breaking the game, they usually mean something like Nurse or Blight, killers with incredibly high skill ceilings that when mastered become extraordinarily difficult to beat, the kind of killers that can produce these absurd win streaks that you see all over the place. But that's not what concerns me here. What concerns me here is something much more fundamental. I believe that the Judgment has a design flaw that can be exploited in a way that creates some of the least interactive gameplay we've ever seen in the history of Dead by Daylight, and I don't even think it's that hard to do. So let me explain. The Judgment's power has a 6-second cooldown. Every 6 seconds, this killer can send a beam across the map capable of removing a health state from a survivor. On its own, that doesn't sound too alarming. Survivors can see the attack, they can react to it, and they can avoid it, right? Or at least that's what I initially thought. However, once you start combining certain add-ons and perks, things become a lot more concerning. To start, the Order of the Inquisition add-on increases the beam's size by 50%, and if the killer also obtains the Zealous power-up you get by sending a survivor to the Void, the beam becomes even larger. On top of that, the cooldown can be reduced by another 20%, allowing the power to be used even more frequently. Now, under normal circumstances, you could argue that survivors will simply learn to dodge the attack. New killers are often very oppressive during the first few days because players haven't adapted to their power yet. And even worse, this often leads to knee-jerk reactions from the developers that result in unjustified nerfs to these killers. The problem here, and what's different, is that adaptation only works when there is something you can actually react to. See, with the perk Mindbreaker, survivors can be afflicted with blindness while repairing generators. If you're not familiar with the perk, there's no requirement or counter to it. It's simply a passive effect that applies to every generator on the map, and once blindness enters the equation, tracking these beams becomes significantly more difficult. In many situations, unless you have like direct visual information on the killer's location, the beam is just too large, it's too fast, and when you have the right build around it, it becomes nearly impossible to react to. So this is where the real issue begins, because if survivors cannot work on generators, then the match itself essentially is stalemate by default, right? And we've seen this before with killers like Skull Merchant during the 3-gen era. But in addition to that, there are also many perks in this game now that monitor gen progress, like Surveillance, Discordance, Gearhead, Oppression, and the newest Hex Hive Mind that can provide an enormous amount of just instant information regarding generator activity. Instead of guessing where survivors are, the killer has instant access to that information. No game sense or skill is required in this sense, just perfect information at all times that you can utilize. So now imagine a killer who doesn't need to commit to chases, a killer who doesn't need to earn pressure through downs like basically every other killer in the game, and a killer who on a 6-second cooldown can interrupt survivors from across the map. If you're not insane, that probably sounds a little bit alarming. Now, during my time on the PTB, I played this strategy extensively, and yes, PTB results should always be taken with a grain of salt. Survivor skill levels vary wildly, and public test environments are rarely representative of the live servers. In fact, they're pretty much never representative of the live servers. But the more I refined this strategy, the less resistance I encountered until it almost became like a laughable joke. Like I felt like I was exploiting the game. And unfortunately, again, it wasn't because I was winning difficult chases or I was making incredible predictions. It was because I was generating pressure almost exclusively through macro gameplay, right? I was looking at what gen are they on, shoot beam to that gen over and over again, not engaging in any chases, literally ignoring people in front of my face because I had the strategy in my mind, and it was just devastating. I'm not joking, I really wasn't interacting with survivors. I was simply preventing them from interacting with the objective. That was my only goal. And it's really important to focus on that distinction because My entire match was focused on static objects. It kind of reminded me of high-level Texas Chainsaw Massacre gameplay when you played the killer and all you did was hyper-focus on objectives without ever needing to commit to any chases. So I think most people would agree, let me rephrase that. I think most rational people would agree that Dead by Daylight is at its healthiest when both sides are encouraged to engage with one another. Chases, predictions, mind games, resource management. These are the things that make the gameplay interesting. Repeatedly firing a projectile at generators from across the map every few seconds is insanely strong, but I don't think many people would describe it as particularly engaging. Now, I could doomsday about this for another hour, but in all honesty, the important question is how likely, whether it's real or not, is this to become a real problem and not just some hypothetical one in a video? And that's the difficult question. Just because something is strong doesn't mean it necessarily becomes popular. The Dead by Daylight community is heavily influenced by content creators. Strategies often don't become widespread until somebody showcases them, right? Sometimes powerful playstyles remain underutilized for months or even years simply because they never become part of the mainstream conversation. A perfect example of that is Plague. Despite being one of the strongest killers in the game for a very long time, which I've shown you over and over again just how brutally strong this killer is, public perception has consistently placed her in lower tiers than where she should be, which is somewhere in S tier, right? So community opinions and actual strengths don't always align. And right now, most of the discussion surrounding the judgment, from what I've seen, is focused entirely on their chase potential. How difficult the power is to aim, how much practice it requires, is it usable on controller, whether or not it's consistent in a 1v1 scenario, etc., right? Which is totally understandable. The problem here is that everyone is looking at the wrong part of the kit. They really are just brain rotting on it. Because if this generator denial strategy catches on, we could end up with a situation that feels remarkably similar to the original launch version of the Skull Merchant during that horrible 3-gen era. And even like the funny thing about that is holding the 3-gen for like full hour, which is like how long you can hold a 3-gen for before the server shuts down. And if I recall correctly, Hens made a video, not even with Skull Merchant, but with Knight, showing how he would hold a 3-gen for a full hour. Horribly toxic thing to do. But he had to showcase it because otherwise people just wouldn't have believed him, right? I think this might be a similar scenario where people just don't really believe you until you prove it to them or show them. The difference here is I don't think that this strategy is necessarily unbeatable. Just like the original Skull Merchant, it's just disgustingly exhausting. Technically, there is counterplay. Survivors can repeatedly leave their generator whenever they anticipate the power being used, which is every 6 seconds. You literally have to run away from the gen because otherwise you'll still get hit by the beam. You have to wait when the beam goes by, then you return to the gen. So you have to bug bite it every 6 seconds, get off, go away. Every single time you hear her power initiate, which is map wide, you can hear the power initiate. But you got to risk the fact that you're going to be missing skill checks, right? Automatically when you get off the gen. So the gen's constantly going to explode. Then the killer's probably going to come to your gen during that time. So like it's going to be really tedious, but I'm not going to say that there is no counterplay. But again, it's repetitive, it's tedious, and it also requires all 4 survivors to understand exactly what's happening. If even one person doesn't understand or simply just isn't willing to play out a 20-minute match, which is, you know what, somewhat reasonable, then everyone else is going to have to work 10 times harder to get that win. So yes, survivors may be able to play around it technically, but I think there's a healthy line between counterplay existing and counterplay being at least reasonable. Again, my concern is not that the Judgment is secretly the strongest killer ever released, or that they're going to have a 95% kill rate, but that the optimal way to play them may encourage very unhealthy gameplay, matches where very little to possibly no interaction even occurs and drag on for ages. But again, it's entirely possible that this strategy that I'm talking about, maybe it doesn't work on live servers, or maybe behavior has already identified the issue and addresses it before launch. It could even be that there is counterplay that has completely escaped me, something I didn't even think of that maybe you did? And if so, please let me know down in the comments. But if none of that happens, then I genuinely think this might be one of the biggest disasters to hit the game. And I wish I could say like in the past, like in its history, but there's like a massive disaster with Dead by Daylight at least once a year. So I guess you could say this will be the biggest disaster of 2026 if what I believe turns out to be true. And it's really an issue. I think that nobody else seems to be sounding the alarm about this, because by not saying anything, it's more likely to go into the live version and then become a reality. Regardless, I think this is something the community should be talking about a lot more before the judgment actually does reach live servers. With all that said, if you enjoyed the video, leave a like, and as always, have a good one.